seamstress here at Minerva, and welcome to my sew along of the Cinch It dress from Charm Patterns. Now, some of you eagle-eyed sewists out there might have noticed that I am sporting what I'm going to call mad sleeve Cinch It dress. And you might be well aware that the Cinch It dress pattern only comes with 2 short sleeve options or that really lovely sleeveless version. But I just wanted to show how gorgeous this pattern was with even adding a sleeve to it, and to prove just how wonderfully trans-seasonal that the Cinch It dress is. So I have taken the sleeve from the Night and Day dress pattern pack, again a charm pattern, and I have popped on the long bishop sleeve that I've added a little bit extra to, just to give me that ruffle over my wrists to keep going with what I'm going to term mad sleeve vibe of my Cinch It dress. Now, don't worry if you don't want to make a long sleeve version of the Cinch It dress. This sew along is still for you, because it doesn't matter what sleeve you are popping on, a sleeve is still a sleeve, so it's still going to be absolutely amazing for you, where I'm going to share with you how I have made this gorgeous dress, and I have added in a huge amount of really beautiful couture finishes that I do with a lot of my sewing, and I'm sharing that with you if you're thinking, wow, this sew along is massively long, it can't take me that long possibly to pop together the Cinch It dress, but I've added in a whole bunch of added extras just so you can take your sewing up to that next level and make a truly statement Cinch It dress. Now, what do you need to make your Cinch It dress? Obviously, you need your Cinch It dress pattern, and also if you're going to go for mad sleeve version Cinch It dress, you will also need the Night and Day dress pattern pack as well, and that will be the bishop sleeve from that pattern pack. Now, the one thing that I will say about the bishop sleeve is that I added on an additional 10 centimetres of length to the existing sleeve to give me that lovely ruffle over my wrist. And also I would say is that I am someone who has larger upper arms, so you might just want to check that measurement of the upper arm of the bishop sleeve, just to make sure that it fits comfortably around your upper arm, and you have a little bit of movement in the top portion of that sleeve. Then once you have sorted out your sleeve quandary of what version of the Cinch It dress you are going to make, you are then good to go to decide upon your fabric. Now, if you're going to go for mad sleeve version, you will need a fairly hefty amount of fabric, I have to be honest. And in this particular fabric, I did top out at 7.5 meters. Yes, I know that is a small mortgage and absolutely ridiculous, but it was because my pattern was a 60 centimeter repeat, and I have got my dress absolutely gorgeously matched through that center front, and I have got that beautiful matchingness within my sleeves as well. And the one thing that I would say is, with my sleeve, when I added on that additional length, that bishop sleeve did come up to just over 1 meter. So out of that 7.5 meters, you are looking at about 2 meters for your sleeves. So that was just over 1 meter each for each one of my sleeves, which is fairly horrific, but hey, you know, sometimes we only make things once, and you know, it's important to have it just how we really want it, so we enjoy wearing it, because if it's never quite how we want it, it does sit in the wardrobe. I have to be honest, I am one of those people. If it's not quite how I want it, I still don't wear it, even if I have made it. So but mad sleeve Cinch It dress will be coming out quite frequently, regardless of how hubby feels about mad sleeve Cinch It dress. Then if you want to go for classic Cinch It dress, which is what I'm going to refer to as Gertie's version that the actual pattern is, when I did my gorgeous version in that art gallery fabric, I needed 4.5 meters. That gave me enough to get that really lovely pattern match down through the front, and also that gorgeous big puffy sleeve that the pattern comes with as well. So it's still quite a bit of fabric when the actual pattern does only say 3.10 meters, but once you start working with a pattern you do end up using quite an additional amount of fabric to get that really nice gorgeous flow through, which is what pattern matching is all about, to achieve those really gorgeous couture finishes. Then the other thing that I added in with my really gorgeous classic Cinch It dress is this really beautiful contrast collar, which I just needed a small amount of fabric for. I think it was roughly about 50 centimeters I worked with, because the collar is on a curve, and that fabric, again from the same collection that this actual gorgeous art gallery from fabric was from, just gave me that really lovely pop of color around the neck edge with that Peter Pan collar. Then once you have decided upon your fabric and got your fabric all sorted, you are basically good to go. And then obviously you need your assortment of tools. So I always find that when I am sewing, I generally use my ruler because I'm tweaking my pattern. I'll have my fabric scissors and my pinking shears because I like to finish off all those edges. Inevitably I will make a mistake, so I will need my unpick. I don't think I've ever made anything that I've never had to unpick something in all my life of sewing. So I have my unpick, I have my really nice pencil that I can draw on my fabric with, and I think that probably just about covers every one of the tools that I do need when I am sewing any project. Then the key elements of items that you will actually need as part of your sewing journey for the Cinch It dress is actually a little bit of interfacing for your neck edge, for your neckline, whether or not you're making the stand collar like I'm wearing, the Peter Pan collar, or also the facing piece that is within the pattern pack as well. You will need some interfacing. Now the interfacing that I particularly like is the lovely cotton interfacing that we do have, because I prefer to have something that is of really good quality instead of that violin, and that is why I always recommend the really beautiful cotton interfacing that, again, I know can be quite pricey, but once you start using it you do realize how much nicer it is to work with than the violin product. And not that there's anything wrong with the violin, I think the violin is absolutely amazing, but I do think if I am spending an awful lot of money on my fabric, and also in the time that I am making up my beautiful garments, I want the best features within those garments that I can possibly afford, and that is why I always buy a really beautiful cotton interfacing, because I just think it does give your me-made garments that little bit more of a couture edge. Then once you have sorted your interfacing, you will need thread, and the best thread that we have, value for money wise, has got to be the coats. Absolutely perfect, absolutely brilliant, and for a lot of my makes I tend to use the natural colour that goes with a lot of stuff, especially all my printed art gallery fabrics. Unless they're a really dark fabric, I do find that I can get away with the natural on an awful lot of them. Then the other thing that you will need will be shirring elastic, and I have to be honest, because I do like that deeper shirred waist area of my dress, especially my Cinch It dress, I do tend to use 3 rolls of shirring elastic, and also I do have about 10 centimeters shirred on each one of my sleeves as well, hence why I have fairly much used all my 3 rolls of shirring elastic. Then the last thing that you will need as part of the main make is a button to finish off that collar detail at the edge. You might like to go with a really nice simple button. A skirt hook works really well if you're going to hide it on the inside and you don't actually want anything seen, because the skirt hook does give it a slightly, I'm going to say, neater finish at the neck edge, and I've discovered that through a little bit of trial and error. So you might want to go with a skirt hook at the neckline if you don't want to go with an actual button. And then the other thing that you will probably notice with mine is that you can see that I have lined the cuff of my Mad Cinch It dress, Mad Sleeve Cinch It dress, and I will be honest, this was more by mistake as opposed to design. And what I have done is that I have lined it with just a really lovely white lawn, and I tend to use white lawn as all my facing pieces as well, especially when I am doing a bold printed fabric, and I don't like to use the same fabric as my facing because I do find when I'm dealing with all these funny multi-shading prints, you will find that those colours do shadow through, and I find I get a much cleaner result by having some white lawn knocking around in my sewing stash. Then once you have got all your bits and pieces, you are good to go, and let's make our beautiful Cinch It dress. Oh, quickly, just before we get stuck in, don't forget to sign into your Minerva account to save the sew along, because yes, the sew along is massively long for the Cinch It dress, but there is lots and lots and lots of great information in the Cinch It dress sew along that you can use for your Cinch It dress, or even for any one of your other projects. So by having an account here with us at Minerva, that does mean you can save this sew along or any other sew along to your Minerva account and come back to it at a later stage. And all you need for a Minerva account is your name and your email address, and when you open that Minerva account with us, we always send you a really lovely thank you to your inbox, so watch out for that. Now, some of you out there may be asking, why am I doing a sew along to the Gertie Cinch It dress when it is fairly much a simple pattern, and also the fact that Gertie herself always includes a very detailed book on how to put together any one of her patterns, and the Cinch It dress booklet is no exception. So you will be able to put together the Cinch It dress absolutely not a problem through the book that comes with the charm pattern. However, I do tend to go rogue, and I do tend to add in a lot of variations to a theme, or perhaps something that Gertie hasn't explained in the book or hasn't done that I actually think works better for the pattern. So you might discover a new finish or a technique that you haven't seen before, and that is what I tend to do with a lot of my own sewing, and that is what I want to share with you as a part of today's sew along. Before we dive in and start perfectly pattern matching our centre front and centre back seams of our Cinch It dress to get that really gorgeous fabric flow through across that centre seam, there is a couple of things that you do need to do first. So the first thing you will need to do is to mark in your dart. Now, normally at the end of my dart in the side seam, I just pop in a couple of tiny little clips just to mark where the dart arms are on my side seam, and I will also place a pin through the centre of my dart at the top there. It will go all the way through my fabric, and then I will draw in the underside of my dart on the wrong side of my fabric. So I know I have got the perfect placement for my dart and the correct amount of fabric that I am to stitch for my dart. Then the other thing is not a must, but it's going to save you a big headache further down the track. Now, whether or not at this point in time you are completely undecided of whether or not you're going to shirr the waist of your Cinch It dress, or you are going to leave it in that really big trapeze style and just wear it with a belt, what I would say to you is mark in that shirring line that is on the fabric, or the waistline I think it's actually referred to. So what I do is that while my patterned piece, so my paper pattern, is still on my fabric, I pin in that particular line. So then I have got a row of pins where I can clearly see where that shirring line is. I then turn over my piece of my fabric and I then pencil in a line underneath. And I do find that just makes it really clear and really visible. Now, you can stop there if that is what you like to do, but I like to do one more step because I think it just makes life really easy and I don't have to be working through all that fabric to find that waistline. And also, when you do go to shirr your actual dress, if you're going to shirr it, you will be shirring it from the right side. So where we have our pencil line actually on the wrong side of our fabric, we need to transfer that line to the right side of the fabric. And what I do for that is that I swap out the lower thread in my machine to a really bright colour that is going to stand out. And then what I do is that I stitch in that particular line, which is going to be the shirring line or the waistline or whatever you want to call this particular marking on the Cinch It dress. And by actually stitching this line in with a really bright coloured thread and also a longer stitch, so I tend to use something that's a 3 or a 4, not quite a gathering stitch but definitely quite a long stitch, and by stitching in that particular line on each one of my quarter panels, when it comes to sewing in that, when it comes to stitching my shirring into position later on, I've got a really good gauge that is perfectly aligned through all my panels. So when I start off my shirring, that will be a really nice and easy job and it won't be a headache where I'm trying to work out where I actually need to start my shirring line at. Then the last little bit of prep we need to do before we can actually start any major stitching of our Cinch It dress is to stay stitch our neck edges. So we stay stitch in each one of the quarter panel neck edges just inside what will be your stitching line. So the seam allowance for the neck is 15mm, so you just want to stitch just inside of that seam, so something that is around 13-14 millimeters. So wherever your quarter 15mm seam allowance marking is on your sewing machine, you just want to stitch a little bit further inside of that line. And by doing your stay stitching around the neck edge, that stops your neckline from stretching throughout the sewing process, and also it doesn't stretch when it comes to putting on your collar to get that really beautiful polished collar look with your dress as well. Now, if you're making the Cinch It dress in the larger cup size, I think it's the D cup and up, you will have a bust dart to stitch in your Cinch It dress, and you won't have to worry about the bust dart if you are making the smaller cup size versions of this dress. So just for us girls, the D cups and up, we need to stitch in our bust dart of our Cinch It dress. Now, as I said, I marked in the arms of my dart, and once I have marked in the arms of my dart, I bring those two arms together with a pin, usually through the center point of my dart, just to get them all perfectly aligned. And once I have lined up the arms of my dart, I then pop in a couple of pins to hold everything into place, and then I do always give my dart a really good press before I take it to the sewing machine. Once you have pressed your dart into place, then what you need to do is stitch in that dart to get a perfect result. Now, the thing that I tend to do is that I will start at the side seam and I will work my way into the center point, or to the end point, I should say, of my dart. And when I start the stitching of my dart at the side seam, I will always do a couple of back tack stitches just to make sure that my dart ends are secure. I will then stitch along that pencil line that I have marked for my dart arm that I can visibly see, and I will follow that line all the way to the pointy end. then once I come to the end of my dart, I will just pull away my fabric and make sure that I take off quite a generous amount of thread. I won't back tack, but what I will do is as I pull away that thread, I will then do a couple of knots at the very end, and there you should have an absolutely beautiful dart without any unsightly puckers at the end. Just a couple of little pointers before we get too stuck in with our pattern match. Don't forget to mark in that notch at the front, which is where you're going to stitch your front to, because obviously our Cinch It dress has that opening at the center front. And also don't forget to notch in your sleeve notches as well. So either do some little clips or just some pencil lines so you know where those sleeve notches do need to be should you be popping a sleeve in your Cinch It dress. The first thing that I like to do when it comes to pattern matching a seam on anything is that what I do is that I draw in 2 widths of my seam allowance as a pencil line in from the cut edge. So what we have here is our center front of our Cinch It dress, and what I do is that I get my trusty little grading ruler and I draw in a line 3 centimeters in all the way down. So that line will go from the hem all the way up to my notch point there. And what this line is, it's 2 widths of the seam allowance. So the seam allowance that we're working with is 15 mil. And what I will do is once I have penciled in that line, I will then turn back my raw edge to that pencil line, and I am going to press in that raw edge all the way along. So I'm going to take it off to the iron and press in that seam. Now we only need to fold over and press 1 seam, so it doesn't matter which seam it is, it's whatever seam works for you. And then what we do is we place 1 seam on top of each other. So by doing it this way, what you've got is a perfect fold line that will be your stitching line, and what we need to do is marry up this particular line all the way down through there. So it's a little bit painstaking, I have to be honest, and it is a little bit fiddly. So I might start with my most dominant bit of my pattern between here and here, and what I'm going to do is that I'm going to pin this into position and then I'm going to stitch that. So you should be able to see along this seam here that we have no grey line, that the grey line is actually on the outside. So when it comes to stitching this particular seam into place, what we want to do is place the grey line that is this side just inside the grey line of that side. So that is almost like our pattern match line. And what we're going to do is also align our pattern here and align our pattern down there as well. Now I've pinned down a length of my pattern match, so if I turn it out this way you should see that we've got a fairly nice pattern match through there. And also if I turn over my garment here, you should see that hopefully when it comes to stitching down that seam I should have a really nice fairly perfect match of my pattern, because you can see here it's matching and fairly much it's matching down here. Now when it comes to selecting my pins to make sure I get that really accurate pattern match, normally you would see that I'm using my really big pins with the big heads and that are a little bit thicker. But I will be honest, I find these slightly more difficult to deal with when I am doing something really fine like this. I like to use the really tiny lace pins, and I find that they give me a much more accurate result because I can stitch so much closer along that seam with these lace pins than what I can with these ones. So I always find these are a worthwhile investment, and to have a pack of them knocking around that you can just use occasionally on something that does need a slightly more delicate pin. Now that I have pinned in a length of my pattern there, what I'm going to do is that I'm now going to stitch this, and fingers crossed I will get this right the first time. So you can see here the first bit of our pattern match is done, and what I have done is that I have got folded under one part of the print, so we're folded under from the grey line underneath on one side there, and then what I have done is placed, I'll just flip this over, and what I have done is placed that fold line just inside of that grey line there to give me that really nice placement all the way down there. And you can see I've even added a little bit of blood to my Cinch It dress. Now the next part that I'm going to stitch, this will be the lower portion of my Cinch It dress from here all the way to the hem. So again, what we need to do is staying on that line through there. It's a lot easier to do through here with the flowers, is that you can see here we have our seam folded over just on the inside of that grey line, and what I want to do is place a pin in it right there. So let's get one of the tiny little pins, and I'm going to fold out this seam and just place my pin in underneath there on that creased line, which is going to be the stitching line. And I'm going to pop another pin a little bit further up. So again, the pin is on one side on the white bit, and on the other bit you should be just inside the grey stitching line. And then what I'm going to do is marry up all my bits down through there like that, and I've got my seam allowance so I know how far in to make sure I've got all those pieces to marry up as I go down that seam. Now I've just pinned in the lower half of that pattern match, again at that 15mm point with my seam allowance, and I've pinned down that creased edge that we had pressed in earlier, and here you can see that 3cm pencil line that's just a little bit further in. And again, I'm going to stitch that into position. Here now I've done the lower portion of my pattern match. It is a tiny bit out there, but I'm not going to worry about it. But generally all through those lower bits of my flowers, I'm really quite happy with that. And now we're just going to move that little bit further up our dress. So again, I have one part of my seam flat and the other part of my seam I have folded over, which will meet those raw edges, and we should be able to just about line up our pattern match fairly perfectly through there. So I'm going to take my next part of my pattern match that I want to make, or pattern match, which will be from here back down to here. So again, to make sure I've got a really nice line up through all of that pattern, I'm just going to marry up my flowers, and I might even take it up to that point through there just to get it that little bit further up to there. And again, I'm just going to flap out my seam and then pop in my pin down that creased line through there. And again, I'm just going to work along that creased line, marrying up those bits of my pattern as I go, flipping it out and popping in another one of those really tiny pins just to make sure it's all held together. And we'll just go a little bit further down, give that a little bit of a tug. There, we should be able to just fold that one out and pop in another one of the pins through there. And again, we'll just have a little bit of a look at the seam through here, which looks quite nice as well. Make sure that's lined up there. Fold out that seam and just pop in the pin there, and we'll pop in another one down through there as well. And then we'll just have a bit of a look here. That looks fairly good, which is really nice because it falls between two black bits. So I just want to make sure that doesn't move. So again, pop a pin in through there, and again through here. That should sit fairly much bang on with the end of that flower there. And again, we'll just fold that out and pop in another pin down through there. So when we fold out that seam that we have done, that should all stitch together quite nicely through there. And here you can just see that thread that we've got going on from the shirring waistline mark as well. Here we have another really nice section of our pattern matched really beautifully, and again we just need to finish off this very top bit. So we just need to make sure that this part of our pattern is pressed over so we don't have any of that grey seam along there. And then what we should have is that part of our seam should just lay up over just on the edge of the white there, and to marry that all the way down through there. So that grey seam line sits just inside on that white edge to get that really nice pattern placement, and we'll just flip over again. Here you can see we've got our notch point, which is going to be the end of our pattern match. So we just need to make sure that it's all lovely and even at that point to marry up that notch point in through there, and obviously we've got the correct length through our pattern, which again we've got that nice line there to marry up with. So we just want to make sure that that line is stitched in through, it's folded along there. And what we'll do is that we'll flip this out, pop in our pin there, which is going to be the end of our pattern match. And then again, we just want to pop in the pins down that folded line that we have pressed in. And before we get too far down, we just want to make sure that this line here is all matched up really perfectly. So we just want to make sure there we've got our line, which is all lined up. So we want one grey line on the inside, one grey line on the outside, and flip that across and pop in our pin down that side through there. And then as we come across through here, that should be really nice and easy to pattern match. Flip it out and pop in those pins down through that folded seam line. Yeah, you can just see the inside of our grey line there. And then as we open up this all the way through, we should have fairly much a really nice pattern match. So again, we will just stitch that into position. Here's the end of my pattern match all the way up to the notch point at the centre front. So you can see along here, it's a fairly good pattern match, except for maybe one tiny little bit there that I've fiddled with a couple of times, but I'm going to learn to live with it. Now, as I've been working on this centre front seam here, I've been constantly pressing it open so it's really nice and even. But what I'm going to do now is that I'm actually going to give it a good flat press, so it's now flat again like that, and I'm going to stitch over my row of stitching, because the one thing that I did forget to mention is that what I have used as my stitch length along here is something that's about 3 to 3.5 millimeters long. So I haven't stitched it with my normal smaller stitch of 2 or maybe 2.5 that you might stitch with. I have gone with a bigger stitch, mainly because it's easier to unpick should I need to unpick anything, and also I made sure I started with a brand new needle as well, so I didn't get any additional unsightly holes from unpicking and restitching anything along there. So we will now just do a row of stitching, literally just on top, or as close as we can to on top of that existing stitching line. Then once I have stitched along my existing stitching line, I'm going to press my seam open and I'm going to finish off the edge of my seam. Now, I do have an overlocker, but because I have made several shirred Cinch It tops, I have learnt not to finish my edges with the overlocker, because when you do finish it with the overlocker, and mine is a 4-thread overlocker, you don't get a completely perfect shirring line across each one of the seams. So through a lot of trial and error, I have on my machine a tiny little zigzag stitch that dips in, comes out, zigzags, dips in and comes out again. I think it may be a casting edge stitch, I'm not sure, but you can either play around with the stitches on your machine and finish your edges like that, because you will find that you will get a much neater finish when you do go to shirr your dress. Now, if you're not going to shirr your dress, feel free to overlock your seams down the centre front and centre back along with your side seams, but I do prefer this particular edge, and what I do is that I place my machine foot right on that centre seam there, and it stitches all the way over there, and then I just chop off the excess. You should be able to see here that casting edge stitch, or what I mean by that flat that zigzag stitch with that little bit of depth in it. So that is just stitched along there, and what I'm going to do now is actually clip back as close as I can to that stitching line without cracking any of those stitches. So sometimes I clip this back first and then I run that zigzag stitch along the edge there, or other times I will actually clip it back like this. And actually, by doing it this way, especially when we are doing the shirring over the top, it does give it a really flat finish, so you're not gaining any bulk along that seam when you're going to shirr it, unlike if you were going to use the overlocker along here, where you do have those 4 threads that when you do go to shirr the fabric, you'll be surprised at how much bulk it actually creates. Now, when I do cut down this seam here, you can see when you chop off the excess how flat and how nice that seam does look. And what I do like to use are my smaller little prim spotty scissors, because these are just, I find, the perfect weight and also long enough to get a really close finish. And I don't tend to like to use my big sewing scissors just in case I do chop in, I hate to say it, to my dress as I'm doing this. So that is why I like a slightly smaller pair of fabric scissors for this particular job. And here we have that really nice centre front seam down there. Even on this side, you can see how nice the pattern match is. And also you can see that we've got a nice finished edge on the inside of our garment, even though it's not actually overlocked. On your dress backs, just repeat exactly the same process once more, pattern matching in sections to get that really nice sharp pattern match across the back of your dress, and again finish off your seams to make sure it looks as beautiful on the inside as it does on the outside. Once we've finished our centre front and centre back seams, the next step that we're going to do on our make is going to be the shoulder seams. Now, I personally don't like an overlocked edge, and nor do I like a raw edge, I have to be honest. I do take the pinking shears out occasionally and finish things off with pinking shears, but in the case of my Cinch It dress and my shoulder seams, what I am going to do is a French seam. Now, if you're not familiar with a French seam, it is super easy, and it was one of the first finishes that my mum ever taught me. And even growing up as a teenager, I think just about everything that I made had a French seam in it. And they are super easy, and once you know how to do a French seam, you will do them forever. Now, you have to stay within your seam allowance for a French seam. So our seam allowance for our shoulder is 15 mil. So what we need to do is actually with the right sides out. So what we have are the wrong sides facing each other, and we're working on the right side of the fabric. Yes, I know that can be quite confusing. And you do think that you're doing something wrong, but trust me, this is perfectly correct. And what we do is that we just pop in a couple of pins along our shoulder seam, so nothing out of the ordinary other than working on the right side of the fabric as opposed to the wrong side of the fabric. And we will pin both shoulder seams at the same time. And I normally just pop in 3 across the shoulders, so it's generally 1 at each end and 1 in the middle. I will then stitch along that edge, and the seam allowance that I will use for that is generally the width of my machine foot. So my machine foot, I have quite a narrow one, so mine is roughly 6 or 7 millimeters wide. So that is actually the half width of the foot, which I will place at the very front there, and we will stitch along both of those shoulder seams of both the left and the right shoulder. So once I have stitched my shoulder seams together on both my right and my left side, what I do is that I take my little scissors again. I have to say I do like these, they are quite good, and I have to be honest, I need my glasses for this. I can't quite see my seam. So what I need to do is just clip along quite close to that machine line. So I don't want to clip right on the machine line, but I do want to have a couple of millimeters, maybe 4 or 5 millimeters of a raw edge next to that machine line that I have just stitched. And again, we do the same to the other side of your shoulder. So you can see by the 2 little strips that I have chopped off, they're not hugely big. They are probably about 3-4 millimeters wide, and it is roughly the same that I have on my shoulder seam. So the next thing that we do is turn our garment inside out, and then what we do is that we fold over that seam, and we just give that seam a little bit of a press. And then you just pop in a pin at the edge there going through that narrow seam allowance, and then you've got that edge. So you should have your stitched edge right at the very top there, and then a pin that is going through it. And then usually at this point, I must admit, I tend to use slightly more pins, because I want to make sure that that seam is really straight and it's going to be right on that edge. So we have that seam pinned into place, and we do exactly the same on the other side. So again, we just give it a little bit of a roll to make sure that that seam is trapped really nice and evenly between the 2 rows of fabric, and we just work down, giving it a little bit of a roll, making sure that that seam is dead even there. Pop in a pin, and then again we just move along to the end of that seam. And then we've got both of our shoulder seams pinned in, and actually what we do have is that raw edge is going to be encased by another row of stitching. Now, don't be tempted to take this straight to the sewing machine and actually stitch in your line again at your 7mm seam allowance width, your foot width. So if your foot is roughly that 7mm, when you stitch it in again at a foot's width, you will have your perfect 15mm seam. So what you need to do before you do machine it is just give it a once over with the iron, just to make sure it's all flat and all really perfect. And then when you do machine it, you will have a perfectly even French seam finished for your shoulder seams of your dress. And then here you should just be able to see the lovely finished shoulder seams of my dress that have that raw edge encased within that seam. So you should just be able to see that where it's all encased. And if we have a look at the other side, we've got a really nice line there and perfectly encased seams, so we have no raw edges. Now, when I have done my shoulder seams, I will then press my shoulder seams to the back of my dress, so those seams will then sit in the back panel portion of the dress. Now, the next thing we're going to do is the collar. Here I have both my collar pieces, so that is the inside collar piece and the outside collar piece, and I've done something a little bit different with my collars because I wanted to make sure the orange print of my fabric was visible at the center front of my collar. I did create a seam down the center back of my collar, and I have stitched that together and finished off that seam with a pinked edge. And equally, because I wanted my white collar all the way through, and I needed to make sure for my underpiece of my collar that my fabric was wide enough, again I have put a centre back seam in the collar. Now the pattern doesn't state this, and you won't necessarily need to do this, but if you have taken on a bold fabric and you want to make sure you have a really nice collar, again you can pattern match the centre back of your collar to get that really lovely finish, whether or not it is going to be visible from the outside of your garment, or perhaps it's just on the inside of your garment like my white collar will be. And then of course we will just assemble the collar like you would any other collar that we were making. So I will just make sure that I take note to marry up my centre back seams, and of course I have also interfaced my collar. So that is really important as well. So you do have to interface one piece of your collar, and normally the interfacing for a collar will go on the outside piece. So whatever piece of your collar is going to be visible from the outside of your garment, if you interface that particular piece, you will always get a much more polished collar instead of interfacing perhaps the inside piece, or what would be called the lining portion of your collar. So here I've just popped in my pins through there, and that is all ready to stitch. Now, while I'm at the sewing machine, I am going to do my facing shoulder seams. Now, I've done something completely different for mine. I decided to make smaller facing seams because I don't like the bulky ones that are supplied with the pattern. I think there is enough fabric going on through the top part of our Cinch It dress, and what I needed and what I wanted was some smaller facings. Now what I have done is my shoulder width of my facing is 8 centimeters wide on both of my shoulder seams of my facings, and then the back portion of my center back facing I have taken down to 11 centimeters. So again, what we're going to do is we're just going to pin together our shoulder facing pieces and make sure you do get them the right way round. And the other thing that I have done is that when I do facings, especially for a printed fabric dress, and especially because my Cinch It, my fabric is so loud, I don't like to use the same fabric for my facing, because what I do find is that the pattern will shadow through. So by using a white lawn that normally I have some scrappy bits floating around my room, I just tend to cut my facing pieces out of my white lawn, and again both of them are interfaced. And for the shoulder seams of my facing, I'm not going to do them as a French seam. I am just going to do them as a standard seam and then trim them back with my pinking shears and of course press them open. I've stitched together my facing piece, and all I need to do now is just clip back that seam allowance with my pinking shears, because I do just want a nice edge on it. So here we have just our neck facing trimmed back with the pinking shears. And then the next thing we need to do with our collar, once we have stitched it, we just need to clip it back a little bit just to reduce some of the bulk. And then once we've trimmed the collar, we do a couple of very tiny notches back to the actual stitching line of the collar. And this just helps to get the collar to mould really nicely, so we can see that really gorgeous curved edge that the stand collar has. So once we've given our collar its little trim with the notches around the curve and all the way through the back, what we then need to do is a row of understitching just underneath the curved edge all the way around the top of the collar that will help to roll that seam underneath. And the row of understitching is done on the under piece of the collar, so not your top edge, your under edge, and it is generally just about 1 or 2 millimeters from the raw edge. When you are understitching a part of any garment, do make sure that the seams that you are meant to be stitching on top of are tucked under, so you are stitching through generally 3 layers of fabric, one being a visible layer of fabric plus 2 seam allowances. I tend to find an easy way to do this is to make sure that I pull at my fabric to almost get that seam exposed. You can see how I'm doing it here, and again just make sure that you have those seam allowances nice and tight under whatever you are stitching, so you do get that really nice close edge or close to the edge row of understitching of your garment. Then here you can see how nice that understitched collar does look. Before we attach our collar to the dress, there is just one thing that we do need to do that is again slightly different to the instructions within the Cinch It dress pattern pack. Now, as I did say earlier, I have redesigned my collar piece, or my neck facing piece I should say. And as you can see, the front of my neck edge, which is here, is much smaller. It is only 5 centimeters in comparison to what our placket detail is down the front of our Cinch It dress. And we do need to finish off that edge, and I find it easier to finish off this edge before I pop on my collar. So what I'm going to finish off that neck edge with is a little fabric bind, and what I've got here is a piece of fabric that is roughly 30 centimeters in length by 6 centimeters in width, and I have folded it over and given it a press, so it's now 3 centimeters in width. So what we have here is obviously on the folded edge, and I've actually also done a stitch line down through the middle of it, so I know exactly where the middle of my 3 centimeter wide strip is, because I've actually cut back my edge at the front of my Cinch It dress, and I don't have any more my full seam allowance. So by having that row of stitching down the middle of my strip, I know where I need to marry up my 2 seam allowances to. So what I'm going to do is, with my strip of fabric, I am going to put right sides together. So I've gone with a plain lawn, so it doesn't matter which side I use, but do make sure that the folded edge, so the edge that is got your fold on it as opposed to your 2 raw edges together. So we want the folded edge to be placed in towards the side seam of your Cinch It dress. So we want that fold line going towards that side seam, and what we're going to do is we're just going to marry up those 2 side seam, or those 2 stitching lines. So where I have got my fold line from my pattern match down the center front of my Cinch It dress, I am then pinning my strip of fabric all the way down that edge. So that is a nice easy little thing that we're going to do, and I'm just going to pin that all the way down to where we have the top of our pattern match. So it's just going to be pinned all the way down to there. Just extend your strip so it's going all the way across, and also extend your placket strip so that's going all the way across as well. And what you do is that again you pin the other side all the way across, so your placket strip looks like that. Right, so you should have your placket strip stitched in like that, and then you should notice on the inside of your dress you can see where you've got that bit that goes literally over the fold. So it's almost like you're doing a sleeve placket in how you would do a sleeve placket if you were doing it in a traditional fitted shirt style. So what we do now is, because we've got, and I'll use this as visual interpretation because it's a lot easier. So because we've got along here now, we're going to have 15mm down here, which is going to be the seam allowance of our neck edge. Then we will have 2 centimeters to there, and then we'll have a seam along there. So we want to start stitching this particular placket into position. It will be 4 centimeters down from that edge. So you can just get a little pencil and whatever ruler that you have handy, and what you just need to do is just mark in, or you could mark it in with a pin if you like, just a little mark so you know where that 4 centimeter mark is. So you'll see why we're leaving that very top bit unstitched later on, and you want to do that to exactly the same position on the other side as well. Right, then once you've marked in those two positions, what you want to do is stitch down that particular crease line that we still have from our pattern match line, because we're working on our, we're visibly seeing, I'm going to say, our center front. So the pieces of our dress that we pattern matched, that's the bit that we're working on and looking at. So we're going to stitch down that crease line, which would have been our pattern match line or our 15mm line. We're going to stitch all the way down to that top of that seam there and back tack it at that end, and then we're going to flip over our seams and taking out our lower pin, and then we're going to start at that particular point there and stitch back all the way to that point there. Right, here we have our placket detail all stitched into position. So it still won't quite look like anything at this stage, but if you follow me on how I'm doing it, it will come together all of a sudden and it will look really beautiful. So we've, as I said, we've stitched it down that front opening either side, and we've stitched it literally flat like that. So we've stitched down that side to there, and you might just be able to make out that the stitching doesn't go quite all the way to the end there, that we just tend to stop just above that stitching line where we've pattern matched the center front seam. And then again, when we turn over to this side, again, you should just be able to see we've got perhaps a break in the stitching from where we've got that center front seam to where we have stitched that placket detail to that front opening. Then the other thing that I have done is that I have zigzagged my edge down through that seam, and what I'm going to do is that I'm now going to cut off the excess. Now you might not want to zigzag it, but I have chosen to zigzag it because it's just something that I do, but either way you could just quite happily clip back that seam with a pair of pinking shears or with your scissors to something around 1 centimetre in length. We're now going to understitch our placket into position, and by understitching, what we're going to do is we're going to pull that placket really tight across those two seam allowances. So that's the seam allowance of the placket and also the seam allowance of our front portion of our Cinch It dress. So I'm just pulling those that placket really tight,
and folding it back over those seam allowances, and I will pop in a couple of pins to make sure it's really nice and firm. And then once I have pinned it into position, I will literally be edge stitching or understitching as close as I can to that existing seam. So we will stitch down one side of the placket, stop, and then stitch down the other side of the placket, and you will probably find it's easier to pull your needle out at that centre front point. I'm now just understitching that placket into position, so I'm stitching as close as I possibly can to the edge of my white placket. However, you may already notice that there is an actual stitching line there, and that is because I forgot to tape it the first time round. Silly me. But anyway, as we come to the centre front point, you will see that I have back tacked. I am manoeuvring my fabric out with my needle in the up position, and what I'm going to do is that I'm going to realign the front of my placket, pulling back that middle seam allowance or that centre front seam allowance, and again I'm going to edge stitch down the other side of my placket, and then I will also do a back tack at the end just to make sure it is all secure and in position. Then once I have pulled out my placket, or what I'm working on from under the machine, you'll see that you've got that edge stitch there, and here you will notice that really tiny little hole at that centre point, centre front seam.
So I have now understitched down through there, all the way down with my placket. I have folded my placket all the way back, and you can see here we've got a tiny little V at the bottom of our placket here, and what I'm going to do is I am going to do some tiny little catch stitches all the way down through there, not too close to the bottom of that V yet, so kind of where I've pointed, where it's pinned into that shape. I am going to slip stitch it literally from there to there, there to there, and I'm going to do it now just to get rid of those pins out of this position. I'll use a single row of thread, and I will just start off by back tacking a couple of times into the very top there. Once I've got my thread all secure, we'll just nip in and I will catch one or two tiny threads there, and don't pull this really tight. Try and have it with a little bit of slack in it, because strangely enough you will want these threads to move a little bit so they all then fall really neatly into shape. So we're going down the placket with my needle facing me. So when I'm popping my thread in and coming out, I am picking up one or two tiny threads. Then I am just pulling it really loose. Then I am placing my needle back in towards me here, and I am just repeating it. Now I've stitched, I don't know, roughly about an inch. So what I will do is that I will now pull a thread slightly tighter, and I will probably do two threads there slightly tighter, and that works as a back stitch thread, and then we will do it again. So we will just work our way down another little length of this placket down here. We'll just get rid of that pin. again, when I think I've done about an inch, I'll just do a couple of little backy stitch threads into that placket, and then we'll just continue a little bit further down. Right, and also you should just be able to see here where I've stuck that little bit of interfacing over my little scissor happy moment. And if I turn this over, you should be able to see hardly any stitches down through there, so you're not going to notice any stitching. Obviously, if you don't want to hand stitch this, you can make your placket perhaps that little bit thinner and machine stitch it with a decorative stitch, but I again personally prefer to not have a stitching line there, especially when I am dealing with a patterned fabric. Now, instead of cutting my thread, I'm just going to completely cheat and just whip it down a little bit through there. Then again, I'm just going to whip it down a little bit through that center seam. Make sure you go through the actual seam and not the dress or the center front of your dress. And then where we've got the base of that pin, again, I'm going to come up, do a couple of back tack stitches, get my pin out of the way, and again, just make sure when you realign your fabric to sew that you've roughly got your first stitch or your first couple of back tack stitches are kind of where you've got that V. You will see in a minute what I mean by that. Again, pop in your stitches and then start picking up that one or two tiny threads. Again, don't pull it so tight. I will be honest, this particular step is not hard to do, and you can do this step once you have stitched together your shoulder seams. However, if you are watching the video before you're taking on your Cinch It make, you might want to remember to do this actual step before you stitch together your shoulder seams, because then you're not quite dealing with as much fabric and it will be slightly easier to do. But again, if you do forget and you are doing it with your front and back stitched together along that shoulder seam, it's not the worst thing in the world to forget to do. You've just got a little bit more fabric to deal with, right? And then again, when we come to that end, we just want to make sure that we do, again, a few little tack off stitches to make sure that that end is secure. And again, you should see that you don't have any visible stitches down the front, and you've just got enough movement within there to make sure it sits all nice and flat without any puckering. And then just obviously pull through your thread to the back, and if you like you can again end off your thread with a couple of stitches within that seam, just so you know that it is secure. Right, then we'll just cut that thread there. As you look at that front, and then you'll go and give it a press, you will actually see that you've got that really nice placket edge. Now, the thing that we need to do next is just finish off this tiny bit in the middle here. And what I do for that is, again, we go back over to the other side, and we just want to line these seams up like this. And maybe I didn't need to do my clip there, so again, maybe don't do a clip. I'm just going to pop a pin through the back of that seam there, so it should come through. Doesn't matter if it doesn't come perfectly through there, but ideally you want it to come between there and there. And then we're going to place it through the other side like that. And it should bring together that particular seam there. And what we're going to do is just get our little bit of thread, and we're going to use the same bit of thread, and I'm just going to catch that all the way down, and I'm going to do this as a double width of thread, and literally I'm just catching this down in that tiny facing piece, and you just want to go either side of the facing piece. If you can keep your pin in a nice tight position, that is always handy. And then you will nip over to the other side. And again, just catch it in through there. Again, make sure at that center seam you've got a couple of really tight stitches. And if you want, you could pick up just 1 or 2 stitches in that side seam to make sure it's flat, but don't pull that edge off too tight there. Just leave a little bit slack in it. And again, a couple of stitches, thread it through the back, pull it nice and tight, cut, remove your pin. And here you should have your really nice opening through that front there, which is caught, but you've got no stitching whatsoever. Okay, so after that slight deviation of doing the front placket, which, as I said, it's probably more ideal to actually do it before you attach your Cinch It dress together at the shoulders, which was something that I did forget to do. So I got all excited after pattern matching my centre fronts. It was like, yep, let's do my shoulders and then my collar, and then I realised, oh no, I forgot to do that. So if you're going to do the placket method that I've just shown you, do try to remember to do that step before you actually attach your dress at the shoulders. But if you don't, it's not the end of the world, it's just a little bit fiddlier to do. So anyway, moving on to our collar, which is really nice and easy. So what you just need to do is just match up your notches that are at the center back of your collar. your shoulder seams and also the center front. So what I like to do is, as we've got that folded seam at the front, on your collar at that front neck edge, just put a little pencil mark to where your 15mm seam allowance should be on both ends of your collar, and that just helps with marking them up into the correct position. If you don't want to do a pencil mark, which I don't think it really matters because I tend to do mine quite tiny, you can just pop in a pin at that 15mm mark so you know where that seam allowance is on your collar and where to perfectly match it at that center front point. You might find, like mine, you get some tiny little lumps in it as you go, but that is more to do with the shaping of the collar than it being too long, because you will find that you'll have all these tiny little curves in the collar as you are pinning it, because obviously you've got one very curved edge, which is your neck edge, and then one slightly more straighter edge, which is the collar edge. But you will find when you stitch that particular seam, that will all come out and your collar will stand really nicely and have that really lovely shape to it. Then once I have pinned my collar into position, I will then stitch it, and I will use a slightly longer stitch. So I will use something like a 3mm length stitch, just to make sure if there's any reason that I need to unpick it to make sure it's perfectly aligned. I've got a slightly longer stitch, which is easier to unpick. And then obviously if my collar is perfect, when I stitch on my facing piece over that same seam, it will be all securely attached anyway. So my collar's gone on without a problem. So I've got that really gorgeous neckline and that really lovely stand collar. Now the next thing we need to do is to finish off this edge, and you will notice that the actual pattern had that really big facing to it, and because my fabric is really light and I didn't want all that bulk, I've gone with my really lovely little slimmed down version. But before I attach this to my actual dress, we just need to finish off that outer edge through here of my collar. And what I'm going to do is that I'm going to run a stitch a foot's width, because I want a centimetre seam allowance on this, just in from that edge, and then we're going to turn it back and press it into position. Now the other thing is, because this is quite curved, when you do your first row of stitching at the foot's edge and you go to turn it under, that very narrow bit at the end there, the outer edge, won't sit as nicely. So then I'm going to go in and do a second row of stitching much closer to the edge. So as close as I can get to the edge, but without quite being on the edge.
So I've done my 2 rows of stitching, one being at a 1 centimetre mark in, and then the other row of stitching is as close as I can get to the edge without actually going off the edge. And also what I have used is a longer stitch. So I have used something which is much more of a gathering stitch. So on my machine, it's about 4.5 millimeters long to help me gather up that outer edge of my neck facing to get a really nice, lovely curve to my facing. And once I have got my stitches all done, I will then manipulate them to bring in that curved edge. So I tend to work from the centre front to the centre back. So I will work from both lots of those centre front edges, and I will curve it through to the back. And once I think I've got my curve fairly much into position from that centre front around to the back, I will then take my facing piece over to the iron, and what I will do is that I will iron in that curve to make sure that curve then becomes really nice and flat, so it will go on to my dress and look really beautifully when I do stitch it into position.
Right, here you can see how I've given that a press, and that is the side that will be visible from the inside of my garment. So that's the right side of my facing, and here is the underside of my facing. And you can just see how by having those 2 gathering lines just to pull in and mold that lower edge, or that round edge, does give it that little bit of shape and makes it really nice and easy to work with. And then the other thing that I would suggest that you do, just fold it over in half and just make sure that your edges are fairly much even from where you have it placed. So just make sure that your edges are even. You can see here that that is slightly out, but it's not hugely out. And then when we fold this edge over here, that looks quite nice. And if I flip it over, that edge there doesn't look too bad. So this one here's got a slight little kink to it for some reason. I don't know why. So I might have a little bit of a fiddle with that just to get that perfect before I move on to my next step. And the next step, what I am going to do is that I am going to stitch in from that edge, probably my foot's width. So I'm going to line this particular edge up with the edge of my foot, and I'm going to stitch in a row of stitching through there just to hold that seam into position. So here you should be able to see my row of stitching that's gone all the way around my facing. Hopefully I have caught it all the way around, but there might be a couple of places where I haven't, but I'm not going to worry about that, because more importantly I should have a really even row of stitching. And now I can attach my neck facing to the neck of my dress. We just need to take our neck facing and place it right sides together, and starting at the centre back, working around to the centre front. I've got a notch in the centre back of my facing that I match up with the back of my collar and the centre back seam of my dress. I just pop a pin in through there. I match up my side seam allowances as well, or my shoulder seams, I should say, more to the point, and then I take it all the way through to the front. Now, don't forget, on the front, we're now got something like a 1 mil, or I should say a 10 mil seam allowance, and the centre front of our collar facing is 15 mil, because I didn't bother to cut that back. So you just need to marry up that stitching line through that front there. So you will have a tiny amount of your facing that will be longer than your garment, so that is perfectly fine. And you do just need to pop in a pin through there as well. And then what you should find is that your flap piece there can go then into that seam underneath, but we'll come to that. So you will find that that should just sit, that lovely little placket front we did should just sit perfectly below that bit of your facing, and I hope you haven't been tempted to cut that off just yet. And then we just mould in our facing piece around our collar. Then again, I will marry up my seam allowance, because we'll know where the seam allowance is on the other front, because it should be bang on at the pointy end of your collar. And I do find that I just give my collar a little bit of a tug just to get it all to mould in around that seam, because it will fit. And then what we do is that we stitch that into position again with our 15mm seam allowance. So once you've stitched your facing into position, so you can see here we've got the right side of the facing out and we've got the wrong side facing the wrong side. You have understitched that tiny little row of stitching all through the collar, and that is when you stitch through all of your seam allowances. So you will have your machine as close as you can to that line, stitching through your thicknesses of your seam allowances there. What you do need to do next is to grade out and to clip in to these seam allowances to reduce some of the bulk. And what you want to do is make sure that you have your longest seam allowance falling over on the front edge there, so you don't get a ridge. So what we want to do is that we want to leave that one there really long, and then we want to clip this one back, which is actually going to be the collar edge. And what you could do with the collar edge, because it's slightly thicker, if you have a pair of pinking shears, you could pinking shear that particular edge, and that will just help with the grading. And then when it comes to that last edge, you just want to clip quite close back to that stitching line. So I've gone in and reduced quite a bit of bulk through that seam. And the other thing that we do want to do is pop in some little clips. So again, we just want to take away a little bit more area with some snips. So the seam that is there that needs to sit flat will actually open up quite nicely, and it will sit nice and flat. Again, just be really careful that you don't snip in to any part of your dress. And also just do a couple of little snips through all your collar pieces as well. Then when I've got all my little snips in there, so my collar is going to stretch out a little bit and sit really nice and flat, what I then want to do is give this a really good press for that to sit down. So that is what we will do next. Clipped all back through here, and I've spread it all out, which you can see. And what I've done is that I have pinned the back neck of my facing to the back of my dress. And what I'm going to do is that I'm going to machine stitch very closely along that edge through there, and I'm only going to do it from the shoulder seams across the back. So we're going to take it from the shoulder seams here and here all the way across the back. I'm not going to do that particular finish on the front because I don't want any stitching on the front, and I think when I finish this off down here, that piece there will sit flat anyway. But I do always find with back neck facings, they sometimes ride up with my collars, so I do just like to secure them a little bit like perhaps a shirt finish that you will find again in some tailoring and men's shirts. So that's why I like to do that. But if you don't want to have any visible stitching, and I say if you just do it really neat, it should look really lovely. But what you could do is slip stitch that into position, much like we did with that front placket. Here we are. Here's the back yoke portion of the back of my dress, and actually you can hardly even see that row of stitching that I've got through there. So you can hardly see that through there, so I'm really happy with that. So then all we need to do now is finish off our center front here, and that is just going to be a really easy turn down stitch like that. So down each one of the center fronts, we just want to turn down our little neck edge like that, pop a pin in it and stitch down that center front seam there, and also on the other side. So again, we just turn down that edge, and you can just see how our facing piece there just comes over that tiny amount of the edging there. It's just that tiny bit longer. So we just need to stitch both of those into position. Then we will clip across that corner to reduce some of the bulk and finish off catching that little bit of our seam there. But we'll start off with stitching down that edge. Here is one finished collar side, all really nice and even, and you can see here that I have got that tape bit going up into the under portion of my collar. So what I have done is that I have stitched my front facing, or my front piece, to my facing piece, and then after I have done that, I have just clipped across that corner to reduce a lot of the bulk, so I've got rid of that, and I have clipped back that part as well to get rid of that. And then what I've done is that I've taken this piece of tape all the way up to the top there, like that. Popped a pin in it there to hold it into position. Then I have just machine stitched across there, and then once I've done that, I have literally clipped it across there. So we've just about finished the collar portion of our dress. I just need to do my couple of little tacking stitches. I'm going to make a little threaded loop and stitch on my button, but before I do that, I am going to crack on and do my side seams of my dress. So all we need to do now is to pin together the side seams of our dress from the top all the way down to the side there. Normally what I will do is that I will pop in a pin at the top and also at the hem. And then I will just make sure that that all falls in correctly, nice and evenly, without stretching anything of my long side seams. And I'll normally pop in a few pins to make sure it's all held into place. And don't forget your bust dart that we would have done at the very beginning. If you haven't already, do press that down towards the waist. So you do want that dart to head down towards the waist of your side seam, and make sure you just pop a couple of pins in along through there. So when you're stitching it, if you start at the underarm point and go all the way down, you should find that your dart will actually naturally fall towards the side, towards the hemline of your dress. I had to think about that for a minute. So you want your dart to be pressed towards your waist or towards the hem of your dress, and then once you're happy with the amount of pins that you have in your side seam of your dress, you can then stitch down both your side seams. Once you're completed your side seam of your dress in whatever method you have wanted to finish off those raw edges, and of course stitch those side seams together, you are recommended to let your dress hang at least overnight before you do take on your hem of your dress. So once your dress has hung overnight, I will be honest that when I have done mine didn't drop very much, but equally it is better just to make sure that your dress does hang, just in case your fabric has a little bit more give in it perhaps than what mine has, because it still may drop a little bit because that hem is cut in a couple of places on the bias, so it could just give just that tiny little bit, and it is better to just let it hem or hang, so you can straighten it off before you do take on your hem. Then when you do your hem, now I personally like a deep hem, and I think that's something that's a little bit brainwashed in me from my mother as a teenager and learning sewing, because my mum always said dresses will hang better with a deep hem. So when it comes to hemming my Cinch It dress, what I have is actually a double width hem, and it is 3 centimeters deep. So my hem totaling in my dress is 6 centimeters. And what I do is that I have a couple of cheat methods when it comes to doing hems, and one of my favorite methods is to do a long gathering stitch as marking up what my hem allowance is. So I have done a gathering stitch at a 3 centimeter width and also at a 6 centimeter width, and additionally I have put in an edge stitch gathering stitch. That's quite a mouthful, isn't it? right on the edge. So again, it's still on the fabric, but as close as I can possibly get without worrying that that thread is going to unravel right on the edge. And by doing these 3 rows of stitching, it allows me to really easily manipulate my hem into position. So I start with my second row of stitching at the 3 centimetre mark, and what I do is that I pull that lower thread just to get a little bit of gather in it, and then I pull it and I iron it as I go, and you will notice that that seam does start to curve in. And then you will also notice that there's a little few bumps in that top bit, and that is why we also have that edge stitching, which is probably within 4 or 5 mils of that raw edge. And I tend to use a pin just to pull in those threads to make sure that they curve really nicely as I iron it. And then once I have completed my 3 centimetre hem, I will then turn up my hem and do exactly the same process for my 6 centimetre hem, which will then give me the double width of my hem. And then again, once that has all been ironed into place, and I've got pins all the way around it, I then sit myself down with a nice cup of coffee or perhaps a glass of wine if I've had quite a long day at the sewing machine and sewing, and I just sit there and quite happily slip stitch my hem into position. Again, I do like to have a hand stitched hem. I don't like to do a machined hem. Don't ask me why. I hate machine hems. I think it really does spoil a handmade garment, and I think why, you know, finish it off so quickly with a machine hem when you can actually just sit there and slip stitch it, and you get a really nice edge that's really secure with that. But equally, you might like to just machine hem your hem on your Cinch It dress, or take my advice, sit yourself down with a cup of coffee, glass of wine, perhaps in front of the telly, and just work your way through that hem. And I find that bit of hand stitching quite therapeutic, and I'm quite happy to do that. You just want to make sure that you do a few little catching stitches first off, and then when I'm stitching down my side seam or the centre front seam or whatever seam it may be, I just make sure I pick up some of that seam and some of my hem seam, and I just do kind of a few stitches into that area to make sure it's all secure. And I just do that usually when I end a thread and start a thread, and I do find that I tend to do that quite often with my arm length thread that I pull off. Then once my thread is all secure, I will then again go in and pick up those couple of tiny little threads from the main part of my dress, and again I will do much similar stitch to what we did when we were tacking down our placket at the front. So it's kind of a, I call it a herringbone stitch. I'll have to have a look up and see what it's called in other parts of the world. But you kind of pick up 2, and what you will find, or you pick up a couple of threads, and then as you go back into the hem, you're always placing your needle. Mine will always place towards the right side because I am right-handed, and that is how I sew. So what you've got here is a couple of stitches that will go into the hem, and then you will catch that into the main part of your dress. And as I am stitching with white thread, when I go into a coloured part, of the hem of my dress, I do just want to make sure that I am grabbing just those tiny little threads, nothing too thick. And again, we will go back into the dress and then back into the hem. So again, we just work our way around the hem like that. Again, don't pull it too tight and make sure there is a little bit of slackness in your threads. If you think that there may be a little bit too tight, make sure that maybe your last one is quite loose. And then again, you will do a couple of back tacking stitches into that hem area just to make sure every couple of inches that your hem is secure before you move on to the next section. And by doing those back tacking stitches throughout the hem area, or especially the circumference of a skirt, or even when you're hemming trousers, anything like that, by doing that back tack stitch every couple of inches, if for any reason your thread does come undone and you pull it, your hem will never ever drop completely out. So you will probably find that maybe you lose a couple of inches of your hem, but you won't lose your whole hem like you can when you do buy you know, fast fashion, I'm going to call it, because you'll probably know from experience that if the hem leg comes down on a pair of trousers, especially if it has been blind hemmed on a machine, you will lose the whole leg of the trousers. So that's the advantage, I guess, of always hand hemming, that your hem's never going to ever come down once you do it. It is there for life for the garment, I have to be honest. And if we just have a little look, you can see through here, I have got a couple of tiny little white threads there, but I'm never going to bother to unpick those. And maybe my thread is a little bit tight there, but hopefully when I iron that out, that should come up really nicely. And you can see part of the hem here that I have already done and ironed into place is fairly perfect with that really lovely little cross herringbone stitch that I do all the way around my hem. So I'm now just going to finish my cup of coffee and crack on with the rest of my hem. Once we've finished our hem and we've gone all the way around, the next thing we want to do is actually get rid of that gathering stitch that we used as our guideline to turn up the hem. So what I normally do is that I just tend to pop a couple of little breaks in the thread with my unpick, and I just gently try and ease it out. And sometimes, I will be completely honest, I'm quite lucky and I should be able to get my thread, and if I just give it a bit of a tug like this, not too severe, because you don't really want to snap the thread, but occasionally it does happen. And what you want to do is that you just really want to pull that thread out all through that lower part of your hem. And that is why, I'll just make sure that I haven't back tacked it at that end. Just want to make sure that that end is loose. Yep. And by making sure that it's loose at each end, it should just eventually pull out really nice and easy. Yep, here you go, you can start to see it's happening. So I'm pulling out that length of thread and we get rid of that, and then somewhere along there you might be really lucky and you should have, yeah, here at this end, here's my lower thread. So when I pull out that lower thread, where it's been snapped at the other end, that will just come out. And there we have no threads in the lower portion of our hem. And then when we press all that into place, that will look absolutely amazing. And as I say, by doing it as a slightly weightier hem, I always do find that things will hang nicer. I don't know whether or not that's brainwashing from my mother as part of my teenage sewing, but I am one for deeper hems, even on my circle skirts or even my semicircle skirts, which the case is with our Cinch It dress. Once my hem is all in place, I then like to finish off my neck edge. Now what I have got here on mine is a really lovely bald edge, little ball button with a black hand done loop. So my loop just goes over my button really nicely. You might find, because you have to have a loop a certain length to get it quite comfortably over your button, so it's nice and easy to come on and off, that you have a tiny bit of a gape between your actual, I'm going to say at that neck edge. Now, if you really don't like that particular gape, what I do recommend to do, it's a little bit fiddly and you might think, oh, that's a bit of overkill, but I do find it works the best. I have stitched a skirt hook on one side, so that is on the side right under my button, and then I have created another loop, so the two of those will go together, and what will happen is that my collar will sit perfectly metered at that neck edge, and it won't have any gaping. Now, you could finish off your collar just like this with that skirt hook and also that loop, which will give it a really secure finish, and your collar will just meet absolutely perfectly. So if you didn't want a button but you still wanted that meeting edge of the collar, that is a really good trick to do at that particular neck edge. While I still have my white thread about, what I'm going to do is, you can see here when we stitch together the end of that facing to our placket detail, that lower part of our placket isn't actually stitched together. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pop in a couple of stitches just underneath there. So I'm just going to pop my needle in underneath that placket, and I'm using a double thread for this. And I'm just again going to go in and out a couple of times just to make sure that my thread is secure, because I don't tend to work with knots because they do cause lumps, so I do tend to go a couple of times in and out of my stitching. And what I'm going to do, I should have done that a little bit higher up, but never mind. And what I am going to do is that I'm just going to gently catch that part of my facing down to my placket, and again I'm just going to do a couple of little casting stitches over that seam, nothing too big, and again you just want to catch in and out of that seam through there. And again, once that's all caught and secure, I will just finish off that edge there. And again, I'll just finish my thread, pop it through underneath somewhere to pull it out, so I can just cut it off and it falls underneath my actual garment. and I've got one tiny little loose thread in there, so I'll just use my unpick to get rid of that. And now we have that facing all secure at that front there. And we will just do exactly the same thing to the other side. While I'm at the stage of finishing off all sorts of little bits before I actually do more of my dress, because I just want to get all these little bits done, I'm actually going to stitch on my button. And as I said, I got this really tiny, lovely little black button that is ever so tiny. And it doesn't actually have a shank on it. So it's just got those two little bits there that you loop through your needle when you go to stitch on a button like this. So your needle goes through there, and what you do is that you will then, as you're stitching it on, you will create a little shank for this button to move about. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to decide on where I want my button, and I do want it fairly close. I'm probably going to put it there, I think, on that point of my dress. So I'm just going to pop my needle into that point, and I'm actually going to pop it, I think, into the grey. And again, I'm using a double thread for this. And what I want to do is that I just want to catch in a couple of stitches underneath to make sure my thread is secure. So we'll do that to make sure we've got a nice secure thread. Give it a tug, it isn't going anywhere. And then what I'm going to do is that I'm going to stitch on my button into that position. So there's my button. I'm trying to line it up so it sits kind of in the middle there. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pop in my needle either side of that grey line. So I've got my needle in there, and that should give me a really nice placement for my button. Yeah, I think that will work perfectly. But what you need to do is make sure that you leave a length of thread between the actual fabric and the button. So when you go back into the button to have it go that way, and then back into as close as you can to the same holes all the way through, what we're actually doing is that we're creating a shank for our button that's going to have a little bit of movement in it. And that's why we want to hold this out just a little way to make sure that we've got that little bit of movement. And as my thread is a double thread, I've done it about 4, maybe 5 times, and that is probably enough to make sure my button is secure and it's never ever going anywhere. And also just make sure that that thread is even. And I haven't got any little dots at the back there, but if I pull through in here, have we got any? There must be a black thread stitching in there somewhere, but still no, not there. But I have gone through a couple of bits there of thick fabric anyway. So once we've done our little loops, what we then want to do is get our thread, and we want to almost wrap it around. So we've got one part of the thread there at the front, and then I've wrapped my thread around the back of my button, and then I'm going to place my needle in that loop. So what I'm doing is I'm actually creating a chain stitch. So again, I've got my thread there. My thread goes behind my button. My needle goes through the loop, and then we pull it really tight. And I'm going to do this for as many times as I can to get that really nice shank on my button. So another go. And again, behind the button, through the loop, pull it really tight, and I might get one or two more just to make sure. If it does kind of double up over each other, I don't think it really matters. It's just making sure that your button is secure. So there we have my button on a really tiny little shank like that. Can you see that? So it's just sitting out and it's sitting nice and firm. And then what we want to do is pop this thread back through into our garment through the other side. And you can see here that I've pulled it through. So we've got nothing there. And what I actually want to do is try and pull this through a little bit. And again, I'm just going to do a couple of tacking stitches into the back of my facing. Actually, I'm going into because that was the white bit, which was my facing. So I'm just going to do a couple of stitches again, just to make sure that my button is never ever going anywhere and it will never come off, and I will never need a spare button because I will never lose this particular button. And again, don't make it too thick because you're dealing with a double thread, and then once you've caught it a couple of times, again, just snap it off. See, unpick comes in handy for so many things, not just unpicking. So here we have our lovely button at the front there, and you will have noticed we haven't done a loop or anything at this side, but what we are going to do, we're going to do that little chain stitch on this side, and we're going to create a loop there. So I want quite a long length of thread because I'm actually going to double over my thread twice and actually work with 4 lengths of thread. So I've got my needle and it's got quite a decent eye on it, so I haven't got any issues in threading through the 2 ends of my thread, so they've gone really nicely through my needle. And then we're just going to pull that all the way back, and you can see here I've then got those 2 threads that my needle's gone through, so we're actually dealing with a length of 4 threads. Pulled off 2 really good arm lengths of thread in the black, and what I'm going to do is I've got some beeswax in my stash, and what I'm going to do is just run my thread through the beeswax, and I'm just going to do that a couple of times, and that should, in theory, stop my thread from actually tangling too much, and also it does give it a little bit of a coating as well. Now, it's not essential, but the one thing that I would say is your beeswax will last you for absolutely ever, so if you can, do buy one, keep it in your stash, and you will be surprised at the odd little sewing uses that it comes in handy for. And as I say, it'll last for absolute ever. So I have coated my thread. I'm going to go in to the back of my dress, and I'm going to pop in a couple of stitches to just make sure that my thread goes in through what is actually the facing part of my dress. And I'm just going to pop in a couple of little stitches to secure my thread. what I'm going to do is that we need to work out where our button sits in relation to where we're going to do our loop. I'm going to place a pin in line with where I have stitched in my button, and that pin is literally parallel into that placket. And what I want to do is that I want to match up the other side of my placket like that, and that should be all flat. That will be like that, and there where that pin is, I want to come out of the other side of my front here. So I want to pop my needle in through there, and you can see my pin, and I just want to slide out my needle that's going to create my loop in that same position of where that pin is. And you should just be able to see that where I've got that thread coming out is where that pin's gone in. So we can take out the pin, pop that in there, and what I want to create is a couple of little loops, or a little loop. And normally when you do loops, you would have quite a long gap through there, but I don't want a long gap. I want something that's quite narrow. So I'm going to slide in my thread down through the middle there. I'm going to make sure I keep my thread nice and neat. Right, so we've got the thread there, and with that loop that I have just created, I want to make sure it will go over my button, so I know that I'm making my loop the correct length, and it's not too big nor is it too small. So I just want to make sure that that is going to slide quite nicely over the top of my button, if I can get it off. Yep, so that comes off. So that length for my loop is fairly good. I might just pull it a little bit longer just to make sure it's a good length. And then what I'm going to do is just pop in my needle back in through that seam and pull out another length of thread to create a second loop. And we just want to make sure that they're not twisted. And to just hold it like that. And I'm going to do one more row of thread to create a third loop. And that now should give me a really nice thick loop that will go over my button. So before we go any further, again, we just want to make sure that that loop will fit over my button quite comfortably. Yep, and it will come off. So I've got a really good length. Right, so I've created my loop, and then the next thing we want to do is again create a chain stitch that is going to go around that particular loop. And what we want to do is get our thread, and we have our thread there and our thread there, and we pop. Right, make sure you don't pull any of your loop too tight because you want all those edges to be the same length. And then what you want to do is bring your thread to the front and work with your needle going under the back. So you want to pop your needle in through the middle, create a little loop, pop your needle through the middle like that, and pull it tight. And you just want to work around your loop in that position. So again, you want to loop, pop your needle underneath, bring it to the front, and create that. And you just want to work around your loop in that particular manner. And it takes a little bit of time, and you do have to be really careful because you don't actually want to twist the thread that you're creating with this loop. So that loop will give you a really lovely smoothed edge as you go all the way around like that. So again, you've got your thread, you put your thread over the top of the loop, your needle goes through and comes out the other side. And this is much harder to do further away, doing it straight to camera than holding it in the right position. So I'll do one more to show you what I mean. And then like that. So if you hold your thread up, needle through the middle, through there, it creates the loop, and then you just pull it across. Right, so here I have my loop looking really nice, and I just need to still do a few more stitches to finish it off. And again, I just want to be really careful that I don't twist my stitches that I am doing, because I have got a really nice flat edged loop. So here I have my loop is all nice and flat, and I've got my thread right through there. So again, I just want to pop my thread back through that seam into there, and what I'm going to do is that I'm going to pull it through, and I might just clip it where it's caught in through that seam there, because it doesn't really matter, because that is just the end of my facing seam. I just want to tear the fabric. I don't want to snap my thread. Right, there we go. So I just wanted to pull that loose. And then what I want to do now is just stitch off that bit of my thread in that seam allowance. And that should give me a really nice, lovely loop at the neck edge of my dress. And again, I'll just keep going through. That's pulled really nice. Pull that off, pop it through, and here we have that really nice loop that is going to sit like that. Now, if you want this edge to sit perfectly buttered up and your loop is maybe a little bit big, but obviously you've got to make sure that your loop will always go over your button. So there is going to be a little bit of slackness in it. What you could do, and I may even do this, is actually stitch a curt skirt hook right there. Now the reason why I've picked out a skirt one is because it is going to be super flat, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to stitch this to the underside of my button, and then I'm going to create another loop on the inside of there.
Now that I've attached my skirt hook to the inside of my neckline, I'm now just going to make the perfect length loop to go through that skirt hook. So again, I'm just going to make sure that that front neck edge butts up really perfectly. It's not too tight and not too loose, and I'm going to wrap my thread around it a couple of times and also secure the thread as I go on the inside of that facing. Once I've got a couple of loops around that skirt hook, again it will be about 3, maybe 4, I will then finish off that loop with that really nice blanket stitch, taking care to make sure that I don't twist my thread as I go. So again, I get a really nice flat loop on the inside of that neck edge where my neck will meet absolutely perfectly.
I thought we would have a little bit of a look at the Cinch It dress before I carried on and did any more. So we've got our lovely placket detail down the front here and that really nice simple loop, and also we do have that skirt hook and that additional loop if you want to make sure it's quite neat and tidy there. You can see all the way down the front here we've got a really lovely pattern flow through all the way across with that pattern. So our fabric is falling really lovely and nice with that continual line of our pattern, and you should just be able to make out the red line, which is going to be the beginning of our shirring line. So normally when I shirr, I would start at that line and then I would work my way down for the 10 or 12 centimetres. I think it is recommended in the book. I will double check that before I start my shirring. And then normally, once I've done that, I would then go back up and do maybe another 5 centimetres just to bring up that line that little bit further, because I do find for me I get a much nicer finish when it is slightly more like that and you don't notice as much or that huge amount of area through the bust. But as you can see, hopefully you can see, what we do have is quite a lot of area within the actual dress. So there, it is quite a large dress, the old Cinch It dress, I have to say. And you can see why a lot of people perhaps may not like the Cinch It dress with all that fabric that does go on in the lower portion of the Cinch It dress. But I do feel if you do make it up and you want to shirr it, it is a really lovely dress shirred. I'm not so much in love with it without the shirring. As you can see, it's got quite a lot of it going on and it doesn't necessarily suit a lot of shapes, but definitely for me, I think once I shirr this dress, it will be completely transformed. I'm now going to shirr the waist of my dress. Now, the reason why I'm going to do my shirring now before I put in my sleeve is because it's just reducing that little bit more amount of fabric that I need to maneuver around the sewing machine, and it just makes life a little bit easier by not having to deal with my sleeves, especially since I am making those really lovely long sleeves to go with my Cinch It dress.
Before we can begin to actually shirr our dress, we do need to load up our bobbin with the shirring elastic. So what I will do is generally load up 3 or 4 bobbins at the very beginning before I go to shirr anything, and when I go to load up my bobbin with the elastic, I normally pop on my bobbin on the machine, wrap around the elastic, pulling it really nice and taut, and then what I will do is that I will hold it with my finger to make sure I get the correct tension, or a bit of tension in that elastic as it loads up onto my bobbin. Here I am starting to shirr the waist of my dress, and you can see that I'm using that red stitching line that we did place on our fabric piece at the very beginning of the sew along, if you can remember back that far, as my indication of where to start shirring the middle of my dress. And as we come up to the side seam of my dress, you will notice that that red stitching line doesn't marry up correctly, and I have actually popped in a pencil line to use as my gauge to make sure that I get that really nice even flow through of that shirring line through my dress in an actual spiral fashion. And you will see what I mean by that as we come up to the side seam, where I don't actually join the line that I first started with, but I take it to a curve. So I am actually shirring in a spiral fashion and not joining any of those shirring lines at any of the side seams. So it just helps to get with a slightly more uniform flow of your shirring by shirring in a spiral fashion. The ideal stitch length to set your machine on when you are shirring is the longest length. So you want to use a stitch that is between 4 and 5 millimeters in length, and that just helps to gather up that elastic beautifully as you are shirring your garment.
So if we have a look here, you should be able to see all that really lovely shirring that I've done, working from that waistline marking all the way down. So I've done a good 12-13 centimeters of shirring, because I like something quite deep, but I think the pattern actually recommends about 10 centimeters. Now you will notice that I've got that red line that we did pop in very early on at the beginning of the make, and what I'm going to do now is that I'm going to unpick this red line because we no longer need this gather thread. So I'm going to get rid of that completely out of the way, all the way across. I've now pulled out that thread that ran across the top there, and what I'm going to do is, because I'm probably 2 rows further down than what I should be for my shirring line, I'm going to go back in at this point, and I'm going to stitch in another couple of rows of shirring, starting at that point and working the other way around.
I think I popped in another 4 or 5 rows of shirring to make sure that I got that really nice high line with my shirring elastic, so it sat just below my bust, and also it finished just below the positioning of those bust darts of our dress.
When it comes to finishing off your shirring, what you want to do is pull through your cotton thread through to the back of your dress, and also you've got your elastic thread, and what you do is that you will just tie the 2 of them off. So I just tend to pop in a couple of knots, particularly at the top and the bottom, just to make sure that that is secure and that is never going anywhere. And then once that is secure and all nice and tight, I will just snip that off.
For any joins that you may have with your shirring elastic, where your bobbin has run out and you've had to reload your bobbin, do make sure that you tie off each one of those individual ends and the start of each one of those threads as well, to make sure that none of your shirring does unravel at any later point when you are wearing your garment.
And here we fairly much have all of our shirring complete, and then the last thing that we need to do is pop our sleeves in. The last step of our Cinch It dress is the sleeves, and to be honest, it doesn't matter if you are going to go with what I am going to term mad sleeve, which is what my husband has referred to my gorgeous long sleeved version, or whether or not you're going to take on perhaps the lovely little puffed sleeve that I've done in my summer version of my Cinch It dress, or maybe you just like that really simple little flat sleeve that doesn't have any gather, or you might just want to go for that really simple sleeveless version. When it comes to doing your sleeve, you will actually do your sleeve for each one of these sleeve types in exactly the same way. So after you have cut your sleeve, what you need to do is make sure that you mark in your notches. So that is the two little notches at the back of your sleeve to indicate that it is the back of the sleeve, a centre notch for the top of the sleeve or for that shoulder line of the sleeve, and then you also have a single notch which is the front of the sleeve. And also, if you are making the capped or the gathered head version sleeve, along with your sleeve head being much wider, you will have a couple of dots about 3/4 of the way through the sleeve head, I think they are, and those dots are to indicate where you will run a gathering stitch all the way through, and that is the gathering stitch that you will pull up with those threads and insert it into the top of your Cinch It dress. And also your Cinch It dress will have those dots marked on it as well, so you know exactly where those gathered areas sit on the placement of your sleeve. Now, once you have decided on your sleeve, and I will just say that my sleeve, as I've said, I've gone with the long bishop sleeve from the night and day dress, and what I did do was that I added a extra 10 centimeters onto the hem of that actual pattern. So my sleeve, absolutely flat, is super duper ginormous. So that gives me that really lovely gathered ruffle at the end there. So where I've started my first row of gathering stitch, that is what would have been the cuff seam allowance on the long sleeve bishop sleeve. So I have added in that 10 centimeters to give me my flounce. If you don't want a flounce as long as mine, you might just like to add in 5 centimeters additional length from the very end of that sleeve from the night and day pack if you are taking on mad sleeve Cinch It dress. So once you have done or decided upon your sleeve, cut your sleeve and made sure that you have a left and right sleeve, because you will notice the difference within this one because the tops of the sleeve are slightly different. Sometimes you do get sleeves that are the same either side, but particularly with the night and day dress long bishop sleeve, it is definitely a front and back sleeve. So the first thing that you will do is bring together the raw edges of your sleeve. So you'll fold your sleeve in half and bring together those edges, and then you will just pin those edges into position. So obviously if you've gone with the short sleeve version, you're not needing to pin as far as I'm needing to pin. So you will just pin that edge, run that edge through the sewing machine. Once you have stitched down your underarm seam and finished off that seam in whatever way you have been finishing off your seams through your Cinch It dress make, whether or not that be that you've taken to them with the pinking shears, you've whipped it through the overlocker, or perhaps you've done that really nice narrow zigzag edge that I've been doing on mine. But either way, you're finished off your underarm seam and then you have pressed that seam open. Then the next thing that we move on to is actually the hem of our sleeve. And the seam allowance for both the sleeves in the Cinch It book is 15 mils, so it's 1.5 centimeters. And basically what Gertie recommends, and it is also how you would do a hem, is that you turn up your edge for 6 mil, and then you would normally press that into position, and then again you would turn over that edge again and press that into position. So it's much like we were doing the hem on the dress, except you're dealing with a much smaller area. So you could also equally finish off this sleeve with that 15 mil seam allowance, turned up once, turned up twice, and then stitched into position, and that would be absolutely perfect. However, I did go one step further and I decided to do a facing on mine. Now, there was two reasons that I did this. One, after actually doing the facing, I decided it looked rather lovely and perhaps wished I'd done it in a silly colour, but that would have shadowed through. So I am quite happy with my white. And also, because I didn't have enough fabric, and I did order more fabric, but then I decided that I wanted that gather over my wrist and I needed at least another 10 centimetres. I had to come up slightly creative and get that 10 centimetres added onto my sleeve with what I already had. So literally I have cut and paste my lower portion of my sleeve together, as I have quite a few stitching lines in various places where I have added on that lower portion, that lower portion of fabric onto my sleeve. I actually want to hide those seams. I don't want them visible. So what I did was that I cut a 15 centimetre width of strip of fabric, exactly the same shape as what my sleeve line is. So as you can see, we have that curved edge to our sleeve, and we do want to make sure that we have that same curved edge on our lining. So literally I just cut a strip of lining exactly the same shape as the lower part of my sleeve for that 15 centimetres in length. And then what we would do is we would just pin this together, right sides together. So we just nip around that with the pins. So I will stitch that into position with a 15 mil seam allowance. Once I have stitched that in, I will then understitch it so that lining rolls under really nicely and you don't see the lining, and you get a very smooth, crisp edge along that lovely ruffled part of my sleeve edge. And then I will clip back that seam to about 1 centimetre in width, and then I'll give it a really good press, and then we will be good to shirr the cuff in exactly the same way that we will have shirred our dress. You can see here that we've got that really gorgeous crisp edge through giving that a press, and also you should just be able to notice that very tiny row of understitching that goes through, as I say, the 2 seam allowances and generally your lining piece, but it's not visible on the main part of your garment. So once you have pinned your facing or your lining or whatever you want to call it into position, and I have done this with a really fine lawn, so again it's not adding a huge amount of weight. And what I do want to do is then pop in my pins all the way around, and I want that to actually hold that lining into position so I can then do the shirring on my sleeve. Now you will want your lining to sit rather nice and flat, and you won't want it to ride up. So you will do, or I should say, popped in quite a few pins all the way around, because I just want to make sure that it sits lovely and flat. Here you can see it's all pinned into position. You might just want to give it one more once over with the iron to make sure that everything is really nice and flat. And then once you have done that, we will be off to the sewing machine to shirr the lower portion of our, well, long sleeved Cinch It version dress.
I'm now going to begin shirring the cuff of my sleeve, and as you can see I have got a few black lines marked up on the arm of my sewing machine, and I've just done those with some sticky tape and also a black marker, and the line that I am working to is the 11cm line, which is what is the actual hem marking or the seam allowance marking for my hem on the original night and day bishop sleeve. So I'm just going to whip around and do a couple of rows of shirring for my sleeve. And then as I come up to the beginning line of my shirring, again you will notice that I have popped a pin in there so I can slow down and make sure that I have that lower seam has a slight curve to it, so I don't meet that line directly, but I actually meet it at that foot's width above that actual line. And then once I have met that line, I am just going to continue with my shirring around the lower portion of my cuff until I get past what should be those pins that are in my cuff that are probably roughly at the 4th row of my shirring elastic. And then once I have got to the pins, I will go through, remove all of those pins so I can make sure that I've got a really nice smooth line there with my shirring. And then once I've got rid of all of those pins, I will continue shirring the cuff of my sleeve until I have got something that is about 10 rows of shirring. So that's what I worked to for my sleeve, was 10 rows.
Once you have both your sleeves all done, we are then good to put them in our Cinch It dress. So we're now up to putting our sleeves in, and it doesn't matter what sleeve you are popping in on your Cinch It dress, the way how to insert a sleeve is essentially the same, except if you're going for the gathered sleeve, where you should have those 2 dots somewhere around there that you will need to gather up that head of your sleeve between those 2 dots that are also marked on the bodice of your Cinch It dress. Now, what I tend to do with all of my sleeves when I insert a sleeve is that I will run through a gathering stitch all the way around the head of my sleeve, and you should just be able to see it here on the yellow bit. And basically that is just really about making my life a little bit easier when it comes to popping in a sleeve, because it does mould in, or you will find that it will mould in that little bit easier by actually having a row of gathered thread. So what you need to do is match up your side seams and making sure that you have the correct sleeve going into the correct part of your garment. So you get your sleeve and you will just pop your sleeve inside your Cinch It dress. So what you want to do is marry up those underarm seams. So you've got right sides together, and we just pop in a pin at that underarm point. We just pop our sleeve all the way in. You should have a notch at the top of your sleeve, which will indicate your shoulder point. And then you should also have a notch on your front bodice, where you will match up your next two with your front notches. And then you should also have one at the back as well. And here you will see a little bit of ease that's in the top of your sleeve here. And what I'm going to do is that I'm going to just pull that thread ever so slightly. And I'm just going to distribute that a little bit more along that back part of my shoulder line. And that just helps to mould in that little bit of ease that is within the sleeve head as part of your wearing ease of the garment. And I will take that back and distribute it fairly evenly from my lower notch point at the back, so where you've got that double shoulder notch. And what you will find is that your sleeve will slightly flute like that, and that is just that wearing ease within the sleeve to allow for movement. And I have put a little bit more ease in my sleeve because I do have quite large upper arms, so I just find that just helps with the wear of my garment when I am wearing it. But your sleeve may not have as much as what mine does. Once your sleeve is all pinned into position and all of your notches are matching, your underarm seams are matching, and your top shoulder line is all lined up with the center of your shoulder and the center of your sleeve head, you're then good to go to stitch your sleeve into position. Once you've popped in your sleeve and finished off your edge, again, I've just stayed with the same finish that I've done all through my dress, and that is that really fine little zigzag stitch that I've been doing, and I've sandwiched together my two seams around my shoulder. I have then steamed the shirring part of my dress, so I set my iron on steam and I just press it over the top there, and it works its magic and it shrinks back the elastic to size, and then you get that really tight part of your dress. And you can see quite visibly here, especially from the wrong side, how even the elastic is, and also how flat that center seam is, so you don't get any lumps when you're going over your seam with your shirring. So again, you've got it all through here, really nice. So that is all done through there. We've got our cuff that has also been shirred, and you can tell here as well. Again, that's really nice, and that's really nice and flat all through there. And my collar at the back, and I didn't realise how grubby my iron was until I went to press this, so I think my iron's going to need a massive big clean after this particular make. And I've also managed to get makeup down the centre front there as well. So here we have my dress, and we will just turn it all through. And here you can see how really lovely that shirred waist is on my dress. And now it's time to try it on. I'm Marie, a mad seamstress here at Minerva. Thank you so much for hanging out with me, and I really do hope that you have enjoyed, shall we say, mad sleeve, cinch it dress sew along, or perhaps you did just take on what I do call classic cinch it dress with that really lovely gathered sleeve, short sleeve, or perhaps just the simple capped sleeve version that Gertie has done her actual cinch it dress pattern with. I really hope you have learnt some new sewing techniques with all the things that I have shared with you with my sew along, and I really do hope that you have been able to bring your cinch it dress up to that next level of couture sewing with one of the many finishes that I have shared with you as a part of the sew along. Once you have made your cinch it dress, don't forget to share it under the hashtag #SewAlongCinchItDress, because we would all love to see what you have made. And don't forget to let me know what you thought of the sew along and where I helped you out the most, perhaps with some of those couture finishes where I did tweak or slightly go rogue through the cinch it pattern. So I'm Marie of Minerva, a mad seamstress. Thank you again for hanging out with me, and I shall see you very soon for another Minerva catch up, sew along, or whatever it may be. So until next time, stay safe, sew on, bye.